I stopped at a red light on Marymount Avenue, staring at the crumpled bills in my hands. $41. That was the entirety of my net worth, enough for half a tank of gas, enough to feed the two little girls asleep in the back seat of my battered truck. But it wasn't anywhere near enough to bury my wife, and it certainly wasn't enough to keep the shattered pieces of my mind from completely falling apart. I counted the money a second time, my calloused fingers tracing the worn edges of the bills. Not because I thought the number would magically multiply, but because my hands needed a mission, anything, to distract me from the echoing silence inside the cab. The traffic light above me remained stubbornly red, casting a harsh crimson glow over the dashboard. In the rearview mirror, I could see my oldest daughter, Wren. She was 3 years old. At some point during the drive, she had woken up. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for her mother. She just stared out the window with a hollow, careful kind of silence. The kind of survival instinct that a 3-year-old child should never have to develop. Beside her, little Posy, only 16 months old, was still asleep, her soft cheek pressed against the rough fabric of her car seat strap. She was completely unaware that this morning the universe had violently ripped away the most important person in her life. Just a few hours ago, my wife, Delia, had been alive. I closed my eyes, and the memories slammed into me like shrapnel. She had been standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tiles, humming a soft tune while stirring a pot of oatmeal, complaining with a gentle smile that we were out of coffee again. I could still smell it, the bitter scent of scorched oatmeal filling the house because, in the chaotic aftermath, nobody had thought to turn off the stove. That's the visceral detail I have kept buried in my chest for 14 years. The kitchen still radiating the warmth of a half-finished morning, while the woman who made it a home lay motionless on the floor, taken by a sudden massive brain aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye, just a devastating end. The light turned green, a horn blared behind me. I pressed the accelerator, realizing with a sickening drop in my stomach that I had absolutely no idea where I was driving. My name is Marcus Halloran. At the time, I was 25 years old. I was a former combat engineer, honorably discharged after multiple deployments, currently working a dead-end job estimating flooring costs just to keep a roof over our heads. We had 17 days left on the lease of our rented house in West Asheville. My annual salary was $41,000, barely enough to survive. Now, I was a widower with 2 toddlers who needed feeding, structure, and a father who wasn't broken. The grief was so absolute, so suffocating, it didn't even feel like an emotion anymore. It felt like a structural collapse, a load-bearing wall being kicked out from under my life. But beneath the overwhelming despair, my military training kicked in. A singular tactical thought cut through the fog: get the girls to a safe perimeter. I pointed the truck south and drove to my parents' house. My parents, Glenn and Maureen Halloran, lived in a pristine, split-level home in a manicured cul-de-sac down in Hendersonville. My father was 56, having retired early after a lucrative career managing logistics for a major freight company. My mother was 53, a part-time bookkeeper who treated human relationships like balance sheets. They had a 4-bedroom house. 2 of those bedrooms had sat empty ever since my younger brother, Cole, had moved out. I pulled into their spotless driveway a little after 3 in the afternoon, my boots feeling like lead weights, and knocked on the heavy oak door. My mother opened it. I will never forget the shift in her expression. She looked at my face, pale and hollowed out, and she instantly understood that a catastrophe had occurred. But instead of throwing the door wide open and pulling me inside, she stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door halfway shut behind her. In her hands she held a pristine white dish towel. She began folding it into a smaller square, and then an even smaller one, treating the fabric as if it were the most critical task in the world, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Delia is gone," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I told her about the morning, the aneurysm, the EMTs, the hospital. I told her that our lease was up in 17 days. And then, swallowing my pride, I asked a question. I phrased it carefully, needing her to understand it was a desperate request, not a demand. "Mom, can the girls and I stay with you for a couple of weeks? Just until I can get my bearings and figure out my next move." My mother stopped folding the towel. She looked over my shoulder, her eyes darting toward my battered truck idling in the driveway. then back to me, then to the truck again. Marcus, she sighed, her tone dripping with a condescending kind of pity. She smoothed out a wrinkle in the towel. Your dad and we just aren't set up for this right now. We finally got our house into a quiet rhythm, and 2 screaming toddlers at our age. It's just too much disruption. Mom, my voice cracked, sounding significantly smaller than the raging storm inside me. Delia died this morning. I have $41 and nowhere to take my children. I know, sweetheart, and it's a tragedy, it really is, she said, shaking her head. But we already raised our kids. We did our time. Your father's blood pressure can't handle the stress. 2 weeks, I pleaded, feeling a humiliating desperation clawing at my throat. I just need a floor for them to sleep on. I'll sort out everything else. That was when the heavy oak door opened wider, and my father, Glenn, stepped into the frame. He wore a crisp polo shirt and an expression of profound irritation. He looked at me, taking in my bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. He looked at my mother, not once, not for a single fraction of a second did. He looked past my shoulder toward the truck, where his 2 orphaned granddaughters were sitting. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the distinct, arrogant cruelty of a man absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. It's not a good time, son, my father said smoothly, crossing his arms. You're a grown man and frankly a former soldier. You should have had a contingency plan. You'll land on your feet. And then my mother delivered the fatal strike, the sentence that I have replayed in my mind every single day for 14 years. We can't be the safety net you run to every time things get a little hard, Marcus. We won't enable your failures, every time as if the worst, most devastating day of my existence was just a bad habit. As if I had made a career out of showing up on their pristine porch with my hand out. The brutal reality was that I had enlisted in the military at 18, paid my own way through life, and had never asked them for a single dime or favor in my entire adult life. I stood on that immaculate porch for a beat longer than I should have. For years, I felt a deep shame about that hesitation, but I finally understand it now. I was waiting for the people who brought me into this world to look past their own inconvenience, to look at the truck and feel something, anything resembling love. To realize they were abandoning their own blood. They didn't, they just stared at me, waiting for me to leave their property. If you have ever stood in front of the people who are biologically wired to love you and watched them quietly run a cost-benefit analysis on your tragedy and decide that you are not worth the investment, then you know exactly what I felt in that moment. It doesn't feel like anger. It doesn't even feel like heartbreak. It feels like the entire earth tilting violently on its axis. It feels like the fundamental laws of the universe are being rewritten while you stand there, holding your truck keys. I felt the ground give way on that porch, and my perspective on family permanently shattered. I turned my back on them without another word. I walked down the driveway, my spine rigid, the combat engineer inside me, locking down the emotional trauma and switching to pure, unadulterated survival mode. I climbed into the driver's seat. My hands, gripping the steering wheel, felt like they belonged to a stranger. Ren looked at me from the back. Where are we going, Daddy? We're going to Grandma and Grandpa Caraway's, I told her, my voice steady, betraying none of the absolute destruction I had just survived. I put the truck in gear, peeled out of their perfect little cul-de-sac, and drove north toward the mountains. I didn't call ahead. I was terrified that if I gave Delia's parents a chance to answer the phone, they would run the same cruel calculus my parents just had. I couldn't survive 2 rejections in one day. An hour later, as the September sun began bleeding gold across the Blue Ridge Mountains, I turned onto the long, rugged gravel road leading to the Caraway Ranch. Hollis Caraway, my father-in-law, a rugged, weathered cattleman who had spent 40 years breaking horses and working the land, was stepping out of the main barn when my headlights swept across the dirt yard. Before I even had the truck in park, he was walking toward me. I opened the door and stepped out, the exhaustion finally hitting my knees. He looked at my face, his sharp eyes reading the absolute devastation in my posture. Marcus, he said, just my name, but the tone carried the terrifying realization that his world was about to end. She's gone, Hollis, I choked out, my military stoicism completely fracturing. Hollis didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between us, grabbed the back of my neck with a strong, rough hand, and pulled me in, holding me upright as my legs threatened to give out. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask about his daughter's final moments. He just held me. Then he pulled back, looked past me at the truck, and delivered the 4 words that saved my life. Get those babies inside. No questions, no ledger, no lectures about his retirement plans or the inconvenience of toddlers. By the time I reached the back door of the truck, Marguerite Caraway, a fierce, resilient mountain woman, was already there. She unbuckled Posey, pulled the sleeping baby against her chest, and looked at me over my daughter's head. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her jaw was locked tight with sheer determination. "You're going to eat a hot meal," she commanded, her voice thick but unbreakable. "And then you are going to sleep. We've got them, Marcus. We've got you." That night, I sat at their heavy wooden kitchen table, eating a bowl of stew I couldn't taste, surrounded by a profound, unconditional warmth. I slept on a pull-out couch with the hallway light left on so my girls wouldn't be scared in the dark. My own blood had slammed the door in my face, but here, in the mountains, a family who had just lost their daughter opened their arms and took in the broken pieces of my life. I didn't know it that night, but the foundation for my revenge had just been laid. I was about to build an empire, and the people who threw me away were going to watch me do it. The weeks that followed Delia's funeral were a blur of agonizing grief and relentless physical labor. My own parents called exactly twice during those first 6 months. My mother called first, her tone laced with the brisk, defensive guilt of a woman who knew she had made a morally bankrupt decision but was desperate to rationalize it. My father called second. His questions were carefully phrased, designed to subtly ask when I was going to stop being a burden on the Caraways and figure my life out. I told them I was handling it. My father audibly sighed in relief, gave a patronizing grunt of approval, and hung up. The crack in our relationship wasn't a loud explosion. It was a structural fracture, the kind of deep, invisible damage that guarantees the entire building will eventually collapse. I didn't wallow. I had 2 little girls watching my every move, and I had the Caraways, who had handed me a lifeline when I was drowning. I had a degree in structural engineering, specialized training in military logistics, and a mind built for analyzing load, cost, and structural integrity. I went to Hollis a month after the funeral and told him I was taking over the operational logistics of the ranch. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't out of gratitude. It was a military-grade necessity to keep my mind occupied and repay the massive debt of loyalty I felt. Hollis handed me the keys to the tractor and pointed to the rotting north fence line. I started there. Over the next few years, I systematically dismantled and rebuilt the Caraway Ranch from the ground up. I didn't just fix fences. Using my engineering background, I completely redesigned their archaic water distribution system, installing a state-of-the-art rainwater capture network that slashed overhead costs by 70%. I expanded the boarding facilities, optimizing the layout for maximum efficiency, and constructed a professional-grade training arena that drew the attention of serious equestrian money. But my most calculated move was the bloodlines. With Hollis's deep knowledge of quarter horses and my obsession with data and logistics, we started a high-end performance breeding program. I tracked genetics, performance metrics, and market trends with the precision of a tactical military operation. By my 7th year on the ranch, the operation was generating serious revenue. But here was the critical tactical decision. I hid it all. I funneled the profits into a web of LLCs on paper. The wealth was owned by a corporate entity. To my parents, I was just Marcus, the grieving widower playing handyman. They loved this narrative. It validated their decision to turn me away. In their eyes, I was a failure. I ran into them occasionally in the nearby town of Hendersonville when I was picking up supplies. I'd be standing in the hardware store, covered in dust, axle grease, and sweat, wearing faded denim and steel-toed boots. My mother, draped in expensive cashmere, would spot me, and her face would immediately pinch in profound embarrassment. "Marcus," she'd say, looking at my grease-stained hands like I was carrying a disease. "Still playing farmhand, I see. Have you given any thought to getting a real job? A desk job, maybe? Your brother just got promoted to regional director." "I'm keeping busy, Mom," I'd reply evenly, keeping my face a blank mask of military stoicism. My father would stand beside her, shaking his head with a condescending smirk. There's no shame in honest labor, son. Just a shame to see a man with an engineering degree waste his potential shoveling dirt for the rest of his life. Let us know if you need a small loan to get some decent clothes. They sneered, they patronized, they walked away feeling vastly superior, totally unaware that the farmhand they were pitying had a net worth that was rapidly approaching 8 figures, and that the dirt I was shoveling was producing world-class performance horses that sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I never corrected them. In the military, you never reveal your tactical advantage until the exact moment you are ready to strike. I let them steep in their arrogance. The real test of my empire came during the worst drought the region had seen in 50 years. The mountains turned to kindling, the hay market tripled overnight, and smaller ranches around us started folding under the financial pressure. The bank called about our operational line of credit, and the tone of the loan officer was aggressive, smelling blood in the water. I was 32 years old, staring at a spreadsheet that indicated a massive cash flow crisis within 6 months. I walked into the kitchen, laid the financials out in front of Hollis and Marguerite, and gave them the tactical briefing. We needed a massive influx of capital immediately to bridge the gap. "What's the play?" Hollis asked, leaning over the table, trusting me implicitly. "The play is the 4-year-old stallion," I said. I had been secretly developing a young quarter horse, a genetic masterpiece with explosive speed and flawless movement. He was the crown jewel of our covert breeding program, destined for greatness. I had planned to keep him under the radar for another 2 years to maximize his stud fee value. But the drought forced my hand. I loaded the stallion into a nondescript trailer and hauled him across state lines to an elite, invitation-only regional auction. I walked into the pristine high society sale barn, wearing my standard faded jeans and a plain work shirt. The wealthy buyers in their tailored suits took one look at me and dismissed me as a low-level groom transporting an unremarkable horse. Then my stallion stepped into the ring. The atmosphere instantly shifted. The bidding erupted into a violent, high-stakes war. 10 minutes later, the hammer fell. I sold him to a massive syndicate for $310,000. Cash, we easily made payroll. We paid off the line of credit in full. We survived the drought without breaking a sweat, and the surplus capital accelerated my expansion plans by 5 years. The breeding program exploded, producing champions that dominated the national circuits. The land, the infrastructure, and the massive business assets fully transferred to my holding company, exactly as Hollis and I had arranged. I was quietly, stealthily becoming a ghost millionaire. My daughters, Wren and Posey, were growing up fierce, grounded, and deeply rooted in the land. Wren had a supernatural connection with the horses, and Posey had inherited my analytical mind, managing the bloodline data with terrifying precision. We were thriving. Then, the tipping point arrived, the moment the fuse was lit for the ultimate confrontation. I was 39 years old when the offer slid across the polished mahogany table of a high-rise law firm in downtown Asheville. A massive, aggressive luxury development group, notorious for buying out prime mountain real estate for elite equestrian resorts, had been quietly trying to acquire the Caraway Ranch for months. I had played hardball. I utilized every negotiation tactic I'd learned, stripping away their leverage and backing them into a corner. The final offer was staggering. $12 million. $12 million for the land, the upgraded infrastructure, and the operational facilities. But the deal came with devastatingly precise terms that I had personally drafted. First, I retained full ownership of the elite bloodline archive, meaning the actual million-dollar genetic intellectual property remained mine. Second, and most importantly, the original farmhouse and the 2 prime acres surrounding it were aggressively carved out of the sale. It was legally, irrevocably deeded to Hollis and Marguerite Caraway in perpetuity. I signed the aggressive, ironclad contract, the check cleared, my cover was finally about to be blown, and I knew exactly how I was going to detonate it. The secrecy ended precisely 72 hours later. The massive $12 million acquisition was a matter of public record, and a prominent regional business journal ran a front-page feature on the deal. There, printed in stark black ink for the entire county to see, was the staggering sale figure, the details of the elite equestrian resort development, and my name listed as the sole proprietor and mastermind behind the holding company that orchestrated it. The shockwave hit my parents' pristine, transactional world with the force of a tactical strike. My phone rang that same afternoon. I stared at the caller ID. It was my mother. I didn't answer. I just watched the screen glow, a cold, calculated satisfaction settling in my chest. She left a voicemail, and I stood in my kitchen and listened to it on speaker. Her voice was entirely unrecognizable. The haughty, condescending sneer she had weaponized against me for 14 years had vanished, replaced by an aggressively warm, cloying tone dripping with sudden, intense affection. "Marcus, sweetheart, your father and I just saw the news in the paper. $12 million. We are absolutely stunned, honey. We are so incredibly proud of the man you've become. We always knew you had this kind of brilliance in you. We heard there's going to be a large celebration at the property before the handover, and we would just love to come and celebrate our son's massive success. Call me back, sweetheart." I listened to the message a second time. "We always knew you had this kind of brilliance in you." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They didn't know anything. They had looked at my boots, my calloused hands, and my grief, and they had calculated my worth at 0. Now that the ledger showed 12 million, I was suddenly their beloved son again. I didn't call her back. I immediately dialed my ruthless corporate attorney. I gave him a set of rapid-fire instructions regarding the formation of a highly specific trust structure. Then I called my eldest daughter, Ren, into my office. She was 16 now, a formidable young woman with my military discipline and her mother's fierce heart. I laid out my tactical plan. I told her exactly what I was going to do at the celebration on Saturday. She listened with total, unbroken focus. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing the strategic destruction I was about to unleash. "Do Hollis and Marguerite know about the trust fund?" she asked softly. "No," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "They don't know about any of it. I want their reaction to be entirely real." Ren nodded slowly, a dark, calculating glint in her eyes. "Grandma Maureen and Grandpa Glenn are going to show up expecting a VIP table. They're going to expect you to hand them a check. When you drop the hammer, they are going to make a face." "I know," I said, a dangerous calm in my voice, "and I intend to watch it happen. Me too. Dad, me too. I am not a saint, and I won't pretend my motives were pure. If you have ever been violently discarded by the people who were supposed to protect you, only to watch them frantically claw at the door, the exact second you become a multimillionaire, then you understand the dark, vicious anticipation I felt. It is not a clean emotion, but it is an incredibly powerful one." The celebration took place on a crisp Saturday afternoon in late spring. It was the final weekend before the luxury development group took legal possession of the outer acreage, meaning the land was still my kingdom for one final day. I spared no expense. We had 300 guests, a massive open-pit barbecue operation, a live bluegrass band, and a professional stage erected near the training arena. My parents arrived early, and they made an entrance that was nothing short of obnoxious. My mother had spent a fortune at the salon. She wore a tailored designer dress and walked onto the ranch with the aggressive, entitled energy of a conquering queen. My father wore polished boots and a smug proprietary grin. They paraded through the crowd, actively networking, introducing themselves to the wealthy auction reps, the developers, and the local politicians as the proud parents of the multimillionaire genius who orchestrated the deal. I watched them from a distance. They treated the ranch hands with polite disdain, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had stood in those workers' boots for over a decade. They believed this party was a homecoming designed to welcome them into my newfound empire. My brother Cole had driven down from Charlotte. Cole and I had maintained a polite, distant relationship. He hadn't been the one to shut the door in my face that day, but he had stood by and watched our parents do it without raising a single objection. I had made peace with his cowardice. He hugged me, genuinely congratulating me on the sale, and I accepted it. 20 minutes before the program was scheduled to begin, my parents finally tracked me down near the stage. My mother threw her arms around me, holding the embrace a beat too long, practically vibrating with greed. "Marcus, oh, look at you. Look at what you've built. We are just overwhelmed with pride." My father stepped forward, vigorously shaking my hand. He looked around at the massive estate, the caterers, the wealth surrounding us. "Son," he said, his voice thick with unearned pride. "You really pulled it off. This is generational wealth. Your mother and I have been talking, and we really think we should sit down next week and discuss asset management. I have some excellent contacts who can help you shelter this kind of capital." He was already trying to get his hands on the steering wheel. He actually believed he was entitled to a seat at the table. "I appreciate the thought, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, a blank wall he couldn't read. "But my assets are fully managed. Just find a seat near the front. The presentation is about to start." I watched them walk toward the VIP seating area. They carried themselves with an arrogant swagger, utterly convinced of their own victory. They had no idea that they had just walked onto a landmine, and I was holding the detonator. At precisely 3 o'clock, the band faded out, and the crowd of 300 people quieted down. My attorney took the stage first. With ruthless, unhurried precision, he laid out the staggering logistics of the $12 million acquisition. The crowd murmured in awe at the sheer scale of the deal. Then he stepped back, and I walked up to the microphone. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw the wealthy developers. I saw the ranch hands. I saw my daughters, standing tall and fierce. I saw Hollis and Marguerite sitting in the front row, holding hands, completely unaware of what was about to happen. And off to the left, sitting perfectly straight with expectant, greedy smiles on their faces, I saw my parents. 14 years ago, I began, my voice echoing sharply across the valley. I drove onto this property with $41 in my pocket, a shattered heart, and 2 terrified little girls. I had absolutely nothing to offer. I was a broken man. The crowd was dead silent. I let my eyes drift toward my parents. Their smiles faltered slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing my mother's eyes. "Before we finalize the handover of this land today," I continued, my tone shifting into absolute, commanding authority, "I want to announce 2 major structural changes to the deal. 2 financial directives that are far more important to me than $12 million. I raised my right hand and nodded to my crew. High above the stage, a massive, professionally designed banner dropped down. The bold black lettering read, "The Delia Caraway Halloran Endowment Fund." I heard Marguerite gasp, a sharp, ragged sound from the front row. "My late wife loved these mountains," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "She died far too young, leaving behind a family that was completely devastated. The first directive is this. I have personally extracted $5 million in cash from this sale to endow this fund in perpetuity. Its sole purpose is to provide immediate, massive financial intervention for mountain families who lose a primary provider." The crowd erupted in stunned applause. The sheer volume of the donation was staggering. I let them clap, but I kept my eyes locked directly on my parents. Their faces had frozen. The greedy anticipation was dissolving, rapidly replaced by a dawning, panicked realization. $5 million had just vanished from the pool they thought they were about to swim in. I raised my hand, silencing the crowd with military precision. The trap was set. It was time to close it. 14 years ago, I said, my voice cutting through the valley like a tactical blade. My family was completely obliterated. We were drowning. We needed a bridge to something stable. We needed a place to land, and the people who built that bridge for us are sitting right there. I pointed directly at Hollis and Marguerite Caraway. The entire crowd of 300 people turned to look at them. I watched Hollis, this tough, weathered mountain man, reach over and desperately grip his wife's hand. Hollis and Marguerite Caraway took in a 25-year-old broken man and 2 toddlers on the absolute worst night of his life. I continued, refusing to break eye contact with the crowd. They didn't ask how much we were going to cost them. They didn't calculate our worth on a ledger. They just set 2 more plates at their kitchen table. They gave my daughters a safe home, and they gave me a reason to wake up the next morning. And in 14 years, they never asked for a single thing in return. Not once. I let the silence hang in the air. I let the weight of the truth crush the atmosphere. "So the second directive is this," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, undeniable register. "The original farmhouse, and the 2 prime acres surrounding it, were entirely carved out of the $12 million acquisition. As of this morning, That property has been transferred by an irrevocable deed directly to Hollis and Marguerite Caraway. Free, clear, and theirs in perpetuity, their home forever. The crowd didn't just applaud. They exploded. They surged to their feet, a massive wave of humanity roaring in approval. Hollis stared straight ahead, his jaw locked tight, doing everything in his power not to break down crying in public. Marguerite wasn't even trying to hide it. Tears were streaming down her face, and I loved her fiercely for it. I found their eyes in the chaos and held them. "Thank you," I mouthed to them. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was everything I had. Now, here is the moment I had engineered for 14 years. I turned my head slowly, deliberately looking past the cheering crowd, directly at the VIP section. Directly at my parents. The haughty, arrogant facade had been entirely annihilated. My mother's face was a portrait of sheer, catastrophic devastation. Her smug expectation of a $12 million payout had imploded. Her hands were trembling. She was realizing, in real time, in front of 300 witnesses, that the one thing she had refused to give me, a floor to sleep on, was the single most valuable investment in the entire valley. Someone else had given it freely, and someone else was walking away with a massive estate. My father stood frozen next to her. He looked at the cheering crowd, at the banner, and then, slowly at me. I held his gaze. I didn't smirk. I didn't sneer. I just looked at him with cold military absolute zero. I let him see the cold, hard truth. He had run the numbers. He had decided I was a liability. And because of that one fatal mistake, he had permanently excluded himself from my empire. He got exactly what he invested. Nothing. My parents didn't leave. I'll give them that. They stayed, and they absorbed the absolute humiliation. When the applause finally died down, I stepped back up to the microphone one last time. "Family," I said quietly, the word echoing off the distant mountains, "is not the people who happen to share your blood or your last name. Family is the people who show up when showing up is the only thing that matters. I have spent 14 years trying to deserve the door that was opened for me. Thank you." 40 minutes later, the party was in full swing. I was standing near the barbecue pits when my mother approached me. She moved cautiously, her arrogant swagger completely eradicated. She looked older, smaller. She started with a desperate attempt at diplomacy. That was a beautiful tribute, Marcus, really." She paused, her voice shaking. "I want you to know, your father and I, we think about that night. We think about what we should have done." "Mom," I said, my voice completely level, devoid of any anger or malice. "I need you to understand that I am not angry at you. What you did back then gave me perfect clarity," I told her, looking her dead in the eyes. "You showed me your ledger, so I built my entire life out of the people who actually showed up, instead of the people who slammed the door." She physically flinched. She tried one last desperate maneuver. "The girls," she whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes. Could there be a way to know them better? To be part of their lives? 14 years too late, she finally asked the right question. "That is entirely up to them," I said ruthlessly. "Ren is 16, Posey is 14. They are fiercely intelligent, independent women with their own minds. If you want a relationship with my daughters, you go ask them directly. You don't negotiate through me." She nodded twice, a slow, defeated movement. It was the nod of a person accepting terms of surrender when they know they have absolutely zero leverage left. My father stepped out of the crowd and stood beside her. He looked at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then, the words finally dragged themselves out of his throat, heavy and bitter. "I was wrong back then. What we did was a mistake." 9 words, 14 years in the making. I didn't forgive him. I didn't offer a hug or a tearful reconciliation. I just let those words sit there in the cold air, because they deserved to sit there. "I know," I said flatly. "I know you were, and that was the end of it. It wasn't a repair. It was just a brutal, factual acknowledgement of reality." I turned my back on them and walked back toward the people who actually mattered. The fatal mistake most people make in life is believing that love is a finite resource, a calculation on a balance sheet, where helping someone is a loan that you are entitled to collect on later. My parents lived their entire lives by that transactional ledger. When I showed up broken and desperate, they ran the numbers and decided I was a bad investment. Hollis and Marguerite didn't run the numbers. They just saw a family in crisis, and they opened the door. And because they did, they inadvertently inherited an empire. So, here is my final tactical briefing for you tonight. Find the person who showed up for you when you had absolutely nothing to offer them. Find them this week and tell them you remember, and if someone you love ever shows up on your porch with their entire life in ruins, do you run the numbers or do you just open the door? Comment a 1 if you think I handled my parents perfectly, leaving the door open just a crack for the girls. Comment a 2 if you would have slammed it shut forever. And comment a 3 if you would have let them back into the fold. Tell me where in the world you are deploying from tonight and what time it is in your sector. If you've ever survived a porch like mine, drop your story below. Someone else fighting that same battle needs to know they aren't alone. And if this operation hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I'd be honored to have you in the squad for the next one. Stay sharp.